And thank you again, everybody, for coming today to Call's presentation. We're Climate Action for Lifelong Learners. And today we're going to talk about getting there greener, EVs and bikes, and what you need to know. Quickly, today's meeting. Shortly, I will introduce our speakers, and our first speaker will be Steve Lapp, who will speak on electric vehicles, followed by a Q&A supported by Michael Barkley from our leadership team. And following Steve's presentation, that'll be around a half an hour and then around 10 minutes for Q&A. We'll have a presentation from Cycle Toronto. We're very excited to have Alison Stewart and Jacky Kennedy with us. And after their half-hour presentation, there'll be a chance for more Q&A. Then, as always, I will go into the action of the day inspired by today's speakers and wrap up with some announcements and upcoming meetings. And as always, please join us for the after chat when we go into our gallery mode and everyone can ask questions. And our speakers have agreed to stay on. I think there will be a lot of questions, so it might be a great time in the after chat to bring some questions and some ideas there as well. So just before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to suggest thinking about today and why you're here. We're so happy you are here. Last month, we had our town hall meeting. And at that meeting, Judy Sheridan shared with us a wonderful video from Will Grant about the 4 levels of action. He talked about our individual action when it comes to advocacy and environmentalism and climate change. The second level is with our family and extended network of friends. The third level is within our own community. And then the fourth level is policy, advocacy, institutions, government, politicians, that kind of thing. He talked about the sweet spot being within our community. And just thinking about today, whether or not you're in the market for an EV or not, or whether you're a cyclist or not, to think about today is this wonderful time to let people you know that may not know about this, people in your community, neighbors, you know, your faith community at schools, just people you know in general that don't know about how much this will help our decarbonization goals, thinking about getting around greener and thinking about EVs and bikes. And just think about that today, and that you'll have the possibility of sharing what you learned today, which is what it's all about as well, spreading the message. So I'd like to introduce you to our speakers for today, which is terrific. Let me just start with Steve Lapp. Steve, to introduce you to him, he graduated as a mechanical engineer from Queen's University in 1980. And after working for a few years in the steel industry at the blast furnaces of Stelco, he went back to school in 1985 and completed an MSc in solar thermal processes. Over the next 20 years, his career covered design engineering and lead engineer roles for transit vehicles with UTDC and fuel cells and batteries for electric vehicles with Alcan. He also worked as an independent consultant, delivering training and installing renewable energy systems for on and off grid applications in Ontario, British Columbia, Lesotho, India, and Jamaica. After teaching in the mechanical engineering department of Queen's University from 2003 to 2004, he was recruited in 2005 to develop and teach a program in sustainable energy systems engineering and technology at St. Lawrence College in Kingston, the first such program of its kind in Canada. Steve bought his first electric car in 1989, his second in 2014, and his third in 2019. Plus, since 2001, Steve has used a solar thermal assisted heat pump home heating system. And Alison Stewart and Jacky Kennedy from Cycle Toronto. Alison Stewart is passionate about sharing her joy of biking and pairing it with her desire to see Toronto expand its active transportation network to improve the city's vibrancy, all which led her to several volunteer roles with Cycle Toronto since 2013. Currently, Alison is the acting co-executive director of advocacy and public policy at Cycle Toronto. Joining Alison will be Jacky Kennedy, who was the director of Canada Walks for Green Communities Canada and spent over 20 years advocating for improved walking and cycling environments, as well as walkable cities and towns across Canada. Jacky retired at 72 and is still a very active traveler, despite being an osteoarthritis sufferer with several replaced joints, including a recent new left hip. Jacky upgraded her acoustic bike to a fabulous e-bike last summer, and I think we're going to hear about that today. So thank you for indulging me in that, because I'm so excited about the quality of our speakers. And why don't we get started? And we're going to turn it over to you, Steve.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, the 1989 EV was not a great car, but it's a completely different world now for EVs. So we're going to have a brief tour this morning. Yeah, thanks so much to the call group for inviting me to speak today. It's a pleasure to be here. I do want to say I'm not affiliated with any companies or commercial interests, so I'm trying to be as agnostic as possible. And if I do mention brands of either EVs or chargers, it's just maybe because they're in a picture. I don't endorse any particular product, and I don't receive revenue from any manufacturers of those products. I have done a few hours of paid work for Plug and Drive, a nonprofit in Toronto that promotes education and experiences with EVs. That's my only commercial involvement. So in half an hour, we're going to go through a lot. It's a very compressed EV 101 course. It's such a huge area to dive into, but I've tried to compress the talk down to the sort of salient points that people tend to be concerned about with EVs. So I'm calling it, EVs are now lower cost. We'll look at that. And I would say basically they're mainstream, even though there are issues for sure in terms of the sort of usability. And we know there's some, condo charger issues and that kind of stuff. So we'll try to tackle all these things quickly and then take questions. So in 30 minutes, we'll look at the differences between different electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We'll look at the available vehicles, greenhouse gas emissions, range, charging, economics, and then we'll look at EVs in the world, because that's obviously a lot of people are concerned about the larger impact of their, there's about 1 billion cars in the world, and ultimately we may have 1 billion EVs. So right now they're being made at about 10 million a year, and the world's still making about 70 million a year gasoline passenger vehicles. So this is big stuff, and we have to think how we're going to manage it all. And then we'll take questions. So first words are, given the nature of this talk and just the nature of transportation in general, cars are not the solution. They're sort of a necessary evil based on, how our society runs. And if you can walk or bike or take public transit, for sure, that there's a lower impact on the environment. But obviously, many of us don't live in cities where that's possible, or we have travel that requires personal cars, or we want to anyway. If you do own a gasoline car and you continue to own a gasoline car, just use it as little as possible. That's one way to reduce emissions if you're not ready to go to an EV. And generally, it takes about 2 years of EV usage to offset the energy that it would take to make a gasoline car. So that's an important myth to bust. Don't keep a gasoline car on the road for 10 years. It's better to junk it or get it off the road somehow. Obviously, there's an invested capital that people aren't going to junk newer cars, but ultimately, it's only a couple of years before an EV is ahead of the game. If your gasoline car or EV car, it behooves us to make them last as long as possible, spend some money maintaining them, because yes, it does take energy to make them. And if we use them less and we maintain them so they last longer, that's also less environmental impact in terms of the manufacturing. So that's just some opening words. Cars are a problem for sure. So the acronyms, let's take a look at what these vehicles are. This slide shows on the left what we call battery electric vehicle. And that's the common industry term for a vehicle that runs 100% on electricity. So basically, I hope you can see my mouse, there's a big battery, and then there's the electric motor and the electronics. And that's the only part of the propulsion system, and it's all electric. And you plug that into some sort of electricity supply. A plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, PHEV, has basically the conventional components of gasoline engine and gasoline tank, but also has an electric motor and a battery such that it can drive short distances, maybe anywhere from 30 to 80 kilometers on a battery charged from the grid. And then if that battery is depleted, you plug the car in, and theoretically you can keep going as long as you keep refueling it with gasoline, or you could stop and plug it in and charge. But PHEVs charge slowly, so we generally wouldn't be charging the battery on a long trip. Most studies show PHEVs reduce emissions by about half compared to a gasoline car, but that obviously depends how you use it. And if you're really diligent using the battery, then it's going to, you have fewer emissions. And then a conventional hybrid vehicle, hybrid electric vehicle, although it has the word electricity in it, it doesn't actually, oh, there's my mouse. It doesn't actually run on electricity that hasn't come from gasoline. So there is no external source of electricity in a hybrid electric vehicle. And although they are referred to as sort of electrified, they are in fact only using energy from gasoline. So you have the emissions associated with gasoline. They're more efficient, but the emissions are still significant. Let's take a look at that in a minute. So most electric cars have a large battery underneath the middle of the car. That's pretty much become the industry standard, and the pickup trucks are the same that are coming on the market. You've got the electronics and an electric motor up front, and or sometimes in the back. Some cars are rear-wheel drive, and if you want to have, I'll just take a step back for a second. One of the big advantages of EVs is that they don't have what we would consider conventional transmissions. There's no clutches, there's no automatic transmissions with the complicated parts that can fail. There's no shifting except in some of the very high-end EVs, the $150,000 ones sometimes have a couple of gears that change, but all the basic EVs have a very simple driveline mechanically. So the longevity and maintenance costs are less for these kind of very robust drivetrains. And generally, if you want to have four-wheel drive in an EV, you just add another motor, either in the front or the back. If you start out with one in the back, you add another one in the front, and vice versa. So there are lots of four-wheel drives, both in the crossover SUV and pickup trucks coming onto the market now. So that's a real quick primer on the mechanics of EVs. In Ontario, we have a fairly low carbon electricity grid, mainly because the bulk of our electricity is made from low carbon emission sources like nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, probably missed one in there. And then the emissions from our electricity production are from natural gas only. We have no coal, we have no oil generation in Ontario anymore. So what we want to do is get EVs, which are a big part of the Ontario total emissions. So this pie chart shows where all the emissions in Ontario come from. We've got various manufacturing, commercial buildings, but this almost a quarter of our emissions in Ontario, about 33 million tons, come from passenger transport. So these are cars, trucks, and SUVs, not commercial transportation. That's a separate category down below where you see freight. And so if we electrify our gasoline vehicles over the next 20 years, we're going to take out a big chunk of these emissions. And we want to do that with low carbon electricity. So it's important that we stay on a low carbon electricity path in Ontario. Otherwise, we won't be removing this chunk of emissions. The next big chunk that you and I, as sort of, we can make personal choices around is homes, residential home heating. Most of the emissions here are from natural gas consumption. There's some oil still used, and especially in rural areas in Ontario, we've got propane and oil being used. But residential buildings are, the next big chunk that we're personally responsible for. So these are the areas that we're going to electrify. It's generally acknowledged by even the electricity authorities that we're going to electrify these areas. It's sort of how fast and exactly the time frame and what the costs are and what kind of programs and incentives we'll have. So these are the chunks that we're going to take out by electrification at the personal level. Then all the other emissions are sort of upstream in industry, institutions, other commercial activities, manufacturing. If we look at emissions from typical use, a gasoline vehicle, depending on whether it's a hybrid or maybe a larger SUV or a quad cab pickup, are sort of in the range of 2 to 8 tons of greenhouse gas per year. So if we look at a house, it depends on the size, obviously, and what temperature you keep it at, but it's heated by natural gas, it's 4 to 10 tons of emissions a year. If you fly, return to Paris, it's about 2 tons per seat in the airplane. So flying to somewhere like Paris and back is about the same as driving a hybrid car for a whole year. Airplanes use a lot of fuel. So those are sort of just relative amounts of emissions, because I'm going to talk about what the EVs produce. Roughly, that means our sort of personal emissions, somewhere in this sort of 10 to 20 tons of greenhouse gas per year. And if we look at the Ontario average, it just happens to be 11.3 tons per person per year. So it's right in the ballpark when we look at these numbers. Obviously, they vary a lot per person, and I'm sure many of you, given you're in this group, have probably already made changes that make your personal emissions less, and it depends how many people live in your house. There's lots of complications there. The point of this slide is that at the personal level, we're usually talking sort of several tons per year up to sort of double-digit tons per year, and those are the numbers we have to get down towards zero in the next, 27 years to 2050. So if we look at gasoline vehicles, they're the first three following from the left. We've got a quad cab pickup, an SUV, a hybrid car, depending on the number of kilometers you drive and exactly the size of the vehicle and all that kind of stuff. The emissions vary. These emissions are shown as tons of greenhouse gas per year based on 20,000 kilometers of driving. And these emissions are just out the tailpipe of the car. There are upstream emissions to extract the crude or whatever form the oil is in before it's made into gasoline. We could probably add, depending on the source of the gasoline, our gasoline in Ontario mostly comes from overseas, from about 10 different countries. And then sort of as about Sarnia and west, it tends to come from Alberta. So we could add more emissions to these if we count the upstream emissions, maybe another 10 to 30%, depending how you calculate it. On the right-hand side are the two little blocks of emissions associated with various sizes of EVs. If we run them on the Ontario electricity grid, so you can see it's a reduction of several tons. Now, some people will debate that this amount really should reflect just natural gas usage to make electricity, because if we add an EV to the grid, we could argue that, well, that means we make that electricity with natural gas. So it's a bit of a discussion point, but even if you assume all of the electricity for an EV is made only from natural gas, you're still at or below the hybrid car usage. And this is why it's so critical that we green our grid going forward. We must maintain a low carbon grid and not add natural gas to make up the additional electricity we're going to need. That's a whole topic on its own, but our EVs are going to be inextricably linked to our grid emissions. And so it behooves us to keep the grid emissions as low as possible. And again, it depends what time of day you charge. So going forward, if we maintain a very low carbon grid, the EVs will continue to be very greenhouse gas advantage. If we add a huge amount of natural gas to make up the electricity we're going to need as we electrify, then the EV has a less positive impact. So that's a critical sort of policy thing that the Ontario government and us have to make sure happens. So range and cost of EVs, sort of the practical things that people really need to know. If we just look at cost, it's incredible how cheap they are to run. At $1.50 a liter, it costs about $7.50 to drive a hybrid car 100 kilometers. Let's use the most famous hybrid car as an example there at 5 liters per 100K. If you have a four-wheel drive crossover using about 10 liters, which is very common for a lot of the four-wheel drive crossovers, costs you $15 to go 100 kilometers at the current gas price, around $1.50. An electric car, the same distance, costs $2 to $3. So less than a somewhat marginal coffee from wherever. The biggest electric cars, let's say the electric pickups, might cost you $4 to $6 to go that distance. So it's a huge cost savings as operators of these vehicles. So this is a super messy slide, but the point of it is these are all the EVs available in Canada. That doesn't mean you can go to the dealership and drive one off the lot, because some of them have 1 and 2 year order times now. But the point of this slide is on the bottom axis is the range as rated by NRCan. That's our official agency at the federal government level that rates the ranges of vehicles. And we can see that many vehicles, if we just add this little circle here, are in the sort of 400 kilometer plus or minus 50, 75, basically in the 400 kilometer range level. And if we look at the y-axis, that's the cost in thousands of dollars, including the impact of the rebate. But we can see that there's a whole bunch of cars in the sort of $38,000 to $55,000 level that have anywhere from sort of 340 to 560, 550 kilometers. So I'm assuming that's sort of the spot where a lot of the people on this call would be interested in potentially getting a vehicle. So the yellow circle that I've added, or the yellow oval, is where the sort of pickup trucks are falling. And for contractors, these are going to offer considerable cost savings in terms of operations. Plus, a lot of them have electrical outlets on them, so they can power tools using the battery of the vehicle. But I think the point of this slide is that there are cars in this sort of $40,000 range that have roughly 400 kilometers range. And we'll look at a little bit more at cost in a minute. So charging, a lot of people have concerns about charging, so let's touch on that quickly. And again, this is a really quick course. Basically, most days you get in your car, it's been charged overnight. That's the ideal scenario. So you basically have a full tank in the morning. And only when you're going on long trips will you charge somewhere else, like trips up over the range of the vehicle, 300, 400 kilometers. I know there's issues with condos and how we're going to get charging into condos. I'm going to leave that for the question period so everybody can participate, but it's certainly a challenge. And right now, obviously, detached homes with garages or detached homes where you charge outside. I charge outside where I live and have for almost 10 years now with no issues. When you go on long trips, you're going to use what's called a level 3 charger, and you get charged some cost per minute to connect to that charge. We'll take a look at that in a minute. And then basically on these longer trips, you need a way to access and turn on the chargers. Not all of them are activated by credit cards. This is a very evolving area, and we did receive a question ahead of the talk about this. The free market is prevailing here, and there are many, many companies that have stepped in to provide chargers. There's some crossover in terms of one app working on another charger, but for sure it's a little bit like the Wild West, and you do need to have a smartphone and different apps, and sometimes it can be a bit of a pain. I certainly travel long distance without any issues, but it does take paying attention to what apps you need and doing some planning. So this is an area as well where government legislation could potentially help. But of course, these companies are all fighting for market share, and not all of them want to cooperate with everybody else. So it is a little bit like the Wild West, and it will take some time. And again, I can take questions on that. Important to remember that PHEVs, the plug-in hybrids, only have level 2 charging. So you going long distance, you're not going to be plugging in and quickly getting a charge in a PHEV. So a lot of people say, how long does it take to charge? And I would say this is my answer for how long it takes to charge. First, you have to park your car. It's a gas car or an electric car, you have to park it. So that time doesn't count. Then you got to get out of your car. Now is the charging part. So you grab your charger connection, you plug it in. So that's how long it charges, and then in the morning you unplug it. And that's going to be the scenario day to day for most people, is that you're just going to come home, plug it in, and only when you're going on long trips are you going to be charging somewhere else. The chargers themselves, there's a couple different types. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you see one called CCS. And that's the one that has the high power or level 3 that you'd use at a en route station or some other service provider, going a long distance, and your car is going to charge fairly fast. I'll show you that in a second as well. The plug that's in the middle is called a J1772. That's what you'd have at home, and or you might find one at a restaurant or an Airbnb or a hotel overnight, and you'd plug in and charge overnight. On the right-hand side is a Tesla plug, which is different. And as most of you would know, Tesla has their own charging network. There are some moves being taken right now by Tesla, both in Europe and United States, to open that network to non-Tesla owners. It's happening sort of state by state and region by region in Europe. I'm not aware that Tesla has opened any of their network in Canada. Maybe someone on the call has a Tesla or knows, but I've not heard that Tesla has opened it yet in Canada. This is all happening as I say, you know, it's evolving right now, all of this charging stuff. But these are the three connectors that are going to be standard going forward. There is another older connector, which is still out there, called CHAdeMO, but most manufacturers are going away from it, and these will be the connectors that are used. These orange dots represent level 3 charging stations in Ontario and associated regions. This is a slide from just a couple of weeks ago. So these are all the places, if you're going long distance, that you could plug in and charge fairly quickly. So you can see that it's certainly in Southern Ontario, there are plenty of chargers. There's a bit of a hole around Algonquin Park, but even in the far north, there are chargers along the main highways, and obviously in going towards Montreal, there are lots as well. So finding a charger is not so much the problem, but you do need to have the apps which operate them, and you need to check the chargers working, because sometimes they do fail, and so the apps usually have comments from people about whether they're working or not. If you have a car that goes 400 kilometers in the summer, you might drive about 350 or 40 before you're looking for a charger. So that's sort of the circle, and I've accounted for the road versus as the crow flies there. So that's sort of one range, and then you would charge, and then within, you know, depending how long you charge, maybe 10 minutes to 40 minutes, depending on your car, you could go another couple 100 kilometers. So this sort of the easy range for a day driving in Southern Ontario, just as an illustration. This slide shows how long it takes to charge based on different charger types. So on the y-axis, I put the number of hours to get 200 kilometers of range charging. This is for like the cars, not the pickup trucks, but most of the sort of mid-size typical EV cars or crossover EVs. So this blue circle shows if you plug in overnight on a level 2 charger, it's going to take you between 3 to 7 hours to get a full charge. And on the bottom axis, you see that I'm showing how the power of the charging. So a few kilowatts, maybe 3 to 10 kilowatts of power is what will charge your car overnight. So that's going to fill you up overnight for not a lot of money, probably sort of $8 to $12. It's going to fill the car overnight. And then this orange circle covers the high rate charging that you'd experience when you're getting a level 3 charge on a highway trip. And the reason it's such a broad, such a wide circle is that the EVs that are coming out all charge at very different levels of power. So some of the very expensive EVs are charging at 350 kilowatts, but most of the EVs that I think people in this group would buy are charging in the sort of 50 to 150 kilowatts, which means it's going to take you anywhere from sort of 15 minutes to maybe 40 minutes to get 200 kilometers of charge. And the rate that's charged for that, the dollars rate, is sort of $5 to $15, somewhere in that range, to charge an EV for a couple 100 kilometers. So it's more expensive to charge in the level 3s, but most of us are only doing that when we're on long trips. I took a trip to Halifax, and it was $59 for all of the charging to get to Halifax. So economics of ownership. Well, I do have a website. You'll see it at the end, and I'm going to put this spreadsheet on the website. Obviously, for a talk like this, it's a lot of numbers, but this is sort of all the data that you have to put in to figure out the life cycle cost of ownership of vehicles. So you've got electricity cost versus gasoline cost, the electricity efficiency to drive the vehicle, inflation rates of gasoline and electricity aren't necessarily the same. How far do you go? Your maintenance costs, your insurance costs. Did you get a loan to buy the car? What's the loan interest? What's the loan term? Blah, 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 blah. So I've taken what I consider fairly realistic data for two sort of modest, just medium cost EVs versus a typical gasoline car at the sort of low end of the initial cost. So all this data was put in and into the spreadsheet. And yes, there's a lot of numbers here. But what's important to recognize here is that I'm using an example of a fairly low cost gasoline car. And my slide is a little bit covered, but I think I used a $24,000 or $26,000 gasoline car. before taxes versus a $41,000 EV, which are available. And then the EV, whoops, I'm sorry. The EV has a rebate of about $5,000. And then you look at the operating cost over time, the reduced cost of maintenance for the EV, the reduced cost of energy, and it's mainly the gasoline consumption that, you know, creates the difference in ownership. But maintenance adds up as well, because EVs don't need oil changes or regular maintenance. They really are quite maintenance free, no tune-ups, none of that kind of stuff. So even looking at borrowing $15,000 to pay the difference in cost, if you look at the bottom, the life cycle cost of ownership after you sell the vehicle at 10 years, the gasoline vehicle still costs you more, about $7,000 more than the electric vehicle. And obviously, if you drive more than 20,000 kilometers a year, the saving would be even higher. So I think that the higher cost of EVs can be justified at this point. It just depends whether people are buying new or used. I'm using the new example here. The big difference is the greenhouse gas emissions. If we're operating on a low carbon grid going forward, you know, there's just that 10 years of emissions is very low. It depends exactly, again, what we use, but a few tons at most versus, you know, 30 or more tons for an EV, for a gasoline vehicle. Sorry about that. So the difference in greenhouse gas emissions is huge, and it should cost you less. So that's the current state of economics. So just to sort of summarize the personal aspects of EVs before we look at the global stuff, EVs running on a low carbon grid, which we have to make sure we build going to, you know, a net zero 2050. There's obviously a huge reduction in greenhouse gases. Those are the typical ranges of EVs, and you could basically knock off about 50% of that range for the absolute worst sort of -20 snowy winter day, 40 to 50% less range. Life cycle costs are clearly lower for the modest cost EVs. Every morning you got a full tank if you charge overnight at your building or your residence. Long distance travel in most of Canada is feasible. There's lots of people driving cross country with EVs, but you do have to pay attention to the charging network and use the apps which help you decide where and which electric vehicle charging networks you're going to use. The lower cost EVs don't have oil changes. The brakes are using regenerative braking, so you have fewer brake jobs. Most studies are showing it's about half the maintenance cost for EV at this point, studies that go back sort of 6, 7, 8 years now. And one of the neat things is that you can heat or cool the vehicle, and obviously there's no gasoline engine idling when you're doing that. So yes, you're using a bit of electricity, but if your vehicle's plugged in the morning or whenever, you can heat or cool the vehicle for literally a few pennies of electricity. So it's nice to be able to do that and not feel you're wasting a lot of gasoline and making a lot of emissions to preheat or pre-cool your vehicle. And you can usually do that remotely as well. A couple more slides and then we'll wrap it up. The impact of EVs on the Ontario electricity grid. A lot of people are concerned about this. The IESO, who is the sort of, you know, manager of our electricity grid, has been looking at this in a variety of ways. They just put out quite an interesting study in December, came out showing sort of the forecast for electricity usage in Ontario. And we'll just use this simple example. 1 million EVs, right now we've probably got over 100,000 in Ontario. 1 million EVs in Ontario would increase our total electricity demand by about 2.5%. So it's going to take us a few years to get 1 million EVs. So we have time to manage this transition. It's not like we're going to collapse the grid overnight. It's going to take time. But eventually, the IESO forecasts 7.5 million EVs in Ontario, and we're going to electrify, you know, houses with heat pumps. We're going to electrify a lot of commercial and institutional buildings. And so the IESO has forecast that basically by 2050, we'll double the total electricity usage in Ontario to what's called 300 terawatt hours, or 300,000 gigawatt hours, or 300 million megawatt hours, but about double if we electrify. And that includes a forecast of 7.5 million electric cars. So this is something that we have to grapple with, and really just the studies are just sort of coming out now for some of the directions we can go into to make this happen. A lot of people are concerned about batteries and what's going to happen to all the batteries and where do the materials come from to make the batteries. What I would say is we often look at that. We have to, whenever we look at going forward, and we tend to think about, wow, this is going to have an impact on mining. But we have to remember that these EVs are going to reduce the impact in existing fossil fuel extraction. So a lot of our gasoline in Ontario comes from countries with very questionable labor and environmental practices. So we're already creating lots of problems in using fossil fuels. And basically the concerns over batteries, I think they have to be looked at in the context of the staggering impact of fossil fuel usage. So that's a really important angle. What it means is that we have to, both at a government level and at a corporate level, we need to have policies and practices that these new minerals, not so much new, but the minerals that are going to be extracted, we have to try to do that in a way where the impacts are managed appropriately. And there are many, many automotive companies now creating policy objectives around these issues. I wouldn't say, the perfection is not going to be what we attain, but the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is the critical thing. And one of the things I sort of come to think about is that we can't ask for perfection when we're just improving. So we can improve with EVs. Will we get to perfection? Probably not. So that's just a compromise that we're probably going to be generating a slightly situation, but we have to think of the bigger picture of climate change as something we absolutely must avoid. Okay, so that's a wrap. Hopefully it's not too far off the time. And I guess we're going to take questions now.
Yes. So there's a question about the EU and their target for 2035. And I know Canada also has a target on EV, on the stopping the production of gas cars. And the question is really, is Canada ready for a 2035 target like the EU is doing for stopping the production of all gas or diesel vehicles?
I think the legislation is a zero emissions vehicle sales mandate. So ideally, all the vehicles being sold will be electric. I think there will have to be some compromise in Canada. Obviously, there's some communities where people drive long distances and live in extremely cold temperatures and need, specific types of vehicles to survive, and those, not so much survive, but to get around, to provide that transportation. So I suspect there will be some accommodation made for some gasoline sales. But remember that the purpose of this is greenhouse gas reduction. So if we get the bulk of people living in urban areas and rural areas near urban areas, if the bulk of these people are in EVs by the 2040s, then we have the low carbon grid, because that really has to come along with it, then we've reduced a massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly, we're going to see EVs manufactured in Ontario. There's all sorts of commitments, and GM's already making the Bright Drop van. In Ingersoll, it's an all-electric van, and Ford and Stellantis have both announced EV production and battery production in Ontario. And if we keep greening our grid, if we keep a low carbon grid, then that manufacturing will also be low carbon. So those EVs and those batteries will actually be manufactured using low carbon electricity, and that's a sort of a further benefit.
Okay, there's another question which you addressed right at the end, but are the minerals really available for such a rapid change as part of that question? And then maybe if you could just touch on recycling of batteries.
So some of the core minerals that are currently being used are lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, copper for the motors and the wiring. There are plenty of these minerals worldwide. It doesn't mean they're in places where they can be extracted without impact. So there's going to be an impact of extracting these minerals, whether it's mines that open up in Canada or whether it's in other countries, and there's a variety of sources of lithium. There are other battery technologies coming along, and some companies have already moved to a lithium iron phosphate battery technology. Millions of these EVs are being made in various places already. And the lithium iron phosphate doesn't require cobalt, so that takes out one of the conflict minerals. There is enough lithium. In fact, there's way more lithium than required to build 1 billion vehicles, but it will have an impact on mining. But again, we have to offset that against the impacts right now of, literally tens and tens of thousands of acres of boreal forests and the impacts of shipping and processing and oil spills. Those are the trade-offs that we're going to make. We're going to have to mine more lithium, and we're going to, in doing so, be producing vehicles that use no gasoline. So eventually fossil fuel consumption drops, and the impact of that fossil fuel production also drops. Worldwide right now, there are about 200 companies looking at large-scale recycling of EV batteries in particular. Obviously, there's a lot of lithium-based batteries already out there in the world. They've been used in phones and laptops and 100 other things. And the EV batteries are obviously big. The problem right now with recycling is that there really isn't a huge supply of used batteries because they're still in cars being driven around. These batteries are going to last probably 10 to 20 years, at least 10 years. Many of them are warranted for 10 years. So we're not going to see the bulk of batteries coming up for even the need of recycling for probably 10 to 15 years. Some companies are already stockpiling EV batteries in anticipation of it being a profitable commercial activity. And I think there is a question again of what kind of policies are going to force recycling. Is it going to be cost effective to recycle? I think that it's, again, one of these areas where we must have policies that make the right thing happen. And this is, an area for advocacy of, groups like this or other environmental groups. And the batteries themselves, they will be able to be recycled, but what is the cost? And does that get forced into the system, or is it cheaper to build new ones and store the other ones? Like in one case in the US, they're being stored in the desert, just sitting in piles in the desert, and they can probably sit there for 100 years. But it would be better, obviously, if we're forced to recycle and get those materials back into new EVs and reduce the mining impact.
There were stories in the past about battery fires and parking garages, and is that a common occurrence, or was it just an issue that was occurring with bolts?
So in terms of fires, yes, there have been a few fires. They are literally in the sort of worldwide now, probably somewhere in the range of 50 to a couple hundred. I'm not exactly sure. The Chevy Bolt in particular had a recall campaign. It's a little hard to know exactly how many fires there were, but about 18 probably of 140,000 vehicles that were manufactured had fires. Some of them were in garages. It was a manufacturing defect in the battery, and GM is currently replacing all those batteries. There was also a Hyundai Kona recall based on manufacturing, same type of technology in the battery. And Hyundai has also replaced all of those batteries. So what I would counter with is that in the US, there are about 300,000 gasoline cars that burn every year for a variety of reasons. So yes, there's been some EV fires, but we have to again look at the 300,000 gasoline cars that catch fire every year in context for the EV fires. I'm not aware of anyone being injured in any of these EV fires. EV batteries do not explode. They do not catch fire quickly. It's not like a gasoline tank being torn open and you have an inferno. They smolder, they smoke, they eventually combust, but they don't explode. So if people are able to get away from the vehicle, they'll be okay. But it's a very rare occurrence, and it'll be less going forward as the technology improves.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was fabulous. And we'll just keep things moving. And I want to turn it over to Alison and Jacky so we can hear about the bike side.
Thank you to Steve for presenting that thorough presentation. That's really interesting to see all of the advances being made in EVs. But that said, Jacky and I are here to talk to you about another opportunity for people to get around greener. And we also hope that in the course of our presentation that we help infuse and share some of that joy for pedal power, as we like to call it. So getting around on a bike, whether it's an acoustic bike or on an EV supported bike. So Jacky and I plan on speaking to you each for 10 minutes because we wanted to make sure that we had time to allow for questions and comments. I'm going to be presenting a quick overview of Cycle Toronto, cycling related to the Active Transportation Network, which includes Complete Streets and Young for All. And then I will be passing you over to Jacky, who will talk about the various kinds of e-bikes. And she'll be talking about Cycle55 Plus, and then we'll be leaving you with some resources and tools. So in terms of the joy of biking, because really it is joyful, it may seem very stressful to people, but part of my origin story, as Karen mentioned in my bio, was that I began volunteering for Cycle in Toronto in 2013. And that was partly because I found myself becoming road ragey and frustrated because of the daily challenges faced when riding a bike in Toronto, and decided that I wanted to maintain my upbeat positivity because that's why, you know, I enjoy biking more than I do driving, walking, or taking transit. So with that, and you know, with your bike, it's easy to personalize at a much cheaper cost than any kind of car ownership. So Cycle Toronto, for those of you who may not know us, we are a grassroots member-based, now registered charity as of 2021 that works to make Toronto a healthier, safer, and more vibrant city by encouraging cycling for as many people as possible. And we do this through our advocacy work, our education work, and through encouragement. Now, part of our awareness and encouragement, and certainly advocacy work, centers around encouraging our policymakers and elected leaders on trying to implement initiatives and policies that will make our streets safer for people to bike and walk and get around. For the recent Toronto election, here's an example of some of the call to actions that we put together with our Coalition for Safe and Active Streets for All. So we work, and we still work and collaborate regularly with Walk Toronto, Friends and Families for Safe Streets, TCAT, which stands for Transportation Center, the Center for Transportation Alternatives. And we also work with 880 Cities, the David Suzuki Foundation, and countless other social justice, environmental groups that try to make our cities and country safer. So one of the things that I'd like to say, despite our name, which is Cycle Toronto, we really are taking a wider view on making our seats safer for everyone. So here's an example, because people who bike like getting together. So we organize group rides to help promote and share our advocacy efforts. And just less than 2 weeks ago, we held our coldest day of the year ride, which thankfully was in between two of the coldest weekends of the year, and had a lovely 6-degree ride with 300 of our community members, just to show people that how joyful and possible it is to bike year round in Toronto. And this year, for the first time ever, our coldest day of the year ride we rode along separated bike lanes the entire way. This is something that was not possible just 4 years ago. So we didn't need to stop traffic to do our ride. Now, in terms of biking is an important part of Toronto's active transportation network. That includes public transit, pedestrians, cycling, various mobility devices, and Bike Share Toronto. So increasingly, even though progress sometimes seems slow, city of Toronto has done a great job of beginning to, one, view active modes of transportation, such as cycling, as an important part of the overall transportation network. Whereas cycling might have been viewed as a fringe activity 10 to 20 years ago, it's now been legitimized and is increasingly being adopted by people because it is the most efficient, affordable, and joyful way to get around in Toronto these days. And bike share, which is one of the city's programs and initiatives to help encourage Torontonians to adopt healthier and more sustainable modes of transportation. Now, this brings us to complete streets. For those of you who don't know what a complete street is, this is a term that city planners are using to describe how we re-envisage our current road space. So you'll see in this slide on the left an example of what Yonge Street looked like in early June 2021 before they put in a complete street pilot. And the middle slide, you can see, the beginning of it being built, and then the end result, which was the end of June 2021, which the complete street was put in place. It includes cafes, it includes separated spaces for a separated bike lane, and it also included improvements to the pedestrian realm, most important of which, or arguably more important, are tightening up the turn radii of intersections. So by tightening up those curbs, it forces cars to slow down when they're making a right turn, because over 75% of all collisions between vehicles and pedestrians take place at intersections. So complete streets is a way of beginning to re-envision and rebuild our streets so that they're safer for all road users by giving everyone their spaces to safely move around. And it's also a way of trying to reduce our reliance on single car occupancy. Because, for example, while having the option for an EV car is an important part of reducing our climate emissions, it's certainly not going to help us achieve our climate emissions if we roll out our EV car strategy in a way that replicates our current situation. We simply don't have the space for everyone to ride their cars, not to mention the public and personal debt and cost that's associated with car ownership. And by making our streets safer for people to get around, it makes it easier for people who are able to adopt something like biking, because the biggest barrier to people taking up cycling is a lack of safe infrastructure. And while this image is a good example of a street trying to begin to carve out spaces for individual car road users, you'll see that the bike lane still isn't a separated bike lane, and there's still a lot of a lack of safety defined spaces. But still, by giving space for cyclists, it's much safer. So as the city moves to complete streets, so too is our advocacy efforts. Because while complete streets include bike lanes, and they also include other important street improvements for pedestrians, when it comes to implementing bike lanes at the risk of reducing vehicular traffic, people really focus on the bike lanes. So to try and open up the dialogue and show the interconnectedness of people who rely on active modes of transportation, such as transit users, people who walk and bike, to show that we all have a shared interest in making our public realm safer. And so, for example, Young for All, the group of volunteers and community members that came together, founded from members of our longstanding Young Working Group. And so evolving our Young Loves Bike campaign to really a Young for All, showing that this isn't about cyclists This isn't about pedestrians. This isn't about transit users. This isn't about car drivers. It's about creating a safer public realm where it's easier for people to get around and give them more options to do so, regardless of their age, ability. And the campaign really hinges on being positive, right? Like the positive outcome of what happens to neighborhoods when complete streets are implemented. For any of you who have visited Destination Danforth or Bloor Street West, you'll have a good example of how economically vibrant those communities are when the street becomes a destination. And in fact, studies show that once you implement a complete street, you will increase that economic vibrancy, because most of the people that shop along these main streets are in fact people that are coming by transit, on foot, or on bike, as opposed to many of the car drivers who drive through the areas. Now on that, there's just a few photos. So part of the success behind the Young for All group, and recently we all celebrated when council voted just 2 weeks ago to make the Midtown Young Complete Street permanent. It involved 18 months of, community organization, volunteers attending community events and encouraging people to sign a petition to make it permanent. And so these are just a snapshot of some of the photos of people that we met on the street when we were explaining to them about the project and demystifying some of the change. So again, all positive, all people from across the city. And on that, I am going to pass you over to Jacky, who will speak more specifically about e-bikes.
Hi, everybody. And I should let you know I'm in Vancouver. And so I'm 3 hours behind you. I did have to get up quite early this morning. So excuse me if you catch me yawning or something. And I haven't been out on my bike since I've been here because we've had about 6 inches of snow. So I'm not very happy. We came here to get away from it. So I'm Jacky Kennedy, and I'm a happily retired senior. And at 72, I'm still very much an active traveler and an advocate for better mobility choices. I do have quite severe osteoarthritis with several replaced joints. And I just 7 weeks ago got a brand new left hip. So I've learned quite a thing or two about staying active and keeping one's joints moving. And one of the things I did was upgrade my bike ride to a fabulous pedal assist e-bike last summer. And wow, this has been a complete game changer for me. It seems to be quite a bit of confusion about people that I talk to about the term e-bikes. And it seems that new and innovative options are popping up every day. So we're going to try and point out some of the differences and how they can be a great choice for commuters, for seniors, and for transporting goods and or people. So first off, the technical stuff. In Ontario, e-bikes need to have a maximum speed of 32 kilometers an hour, a maximum weight of 120 kilograms, and the motor can't exceed 500 watts. You have to be over 16 years of age, and you do have to wear a helmet when riding. The way that I like to describe, or we'll go to the next slide, sorry, Alison. The way I like to describe the differences between e-bikes is to first look at how they're being used. So if someone is employed as a courier or delivery person for companies like Uber Eats, DoorDash, etc., they will likely prefer to ride a heavy-duty, fully electric bike, referred to as power-assisted e-bikes. And you can see that from the image. These bikes are pretty heavy. They often have quite chunky wheels. And if you watch the rider carefully, you'll see that they only pedal when to get the bike moving. And then they zoom along on just battery power until it runs out and they have to stop and charge it. One does have to watch out for these riders because they whip around town doing their time-sensitive deliveries. And in Toronto, we have to remember that these kind of bikes are not legally allowed in our bike lanes, although you will find them in the bike lanes, but a lot of times you'll find them also on the roads. Now, I often find people, especially drivers, get quite upset with these types of e-bikes. But I find that a little bit of a privileged attitude because I ask people, well, during COVID, did you use delivery services for food and whatnot? And if you did, do you still continue to use them? And a lot of people say yes. So I say, well, let's remember that these riders are filling a need, they're delivering a service, they're getting paid very little and risking their lives on Toronto's really bike-unfriendly streets. So personally, I give them a wide berth and let them get on their way. The next slide. Another growing trend are e-cargo bikes. And here's one here, a FedEx rider. And you're starting to see more and more of these around Toronto. They're becoming very popular with companies large and small, as well as for parents for transporting children to school and back, picking up your groceries. And they're actually a good choice in a congested city like Toronto because they can get to destinations much faster than trucks. And they don't take up road space when they're parked and doing their deliveries. So I think we're going to see more and more of this. A lot of the courier companies are piloting them, and they're quite a common sight now in and around Toronto. The next slide. Then we have the growing demand for pedal assist e-bikes, and that's what you're seeing here. These can be ridden quite comfortably as a regular bike, but an adjustment to the battery power will give you a boost to help you on your hills or even on uneven paving. Excuse me. The best way to describe the ride is to imagine a hand on your back, giving you a gentle push up the hill when you engage the battery and increase its power. And pedal assist e-bikes are allowed in Toronto's bike lanes. Next slide, please. So this is my pedal assist e-bike. Living in Midtown Toronto means that regardless of where I travel, my journey is always up the hill. Yes, there's a behemoth of a hill from Summerhill up to St. Clair. So if you live in Toronto, you'll know what I mean. The beauty of my e-bike is that when I need a boost, like to get up that hill on the way home, a quick adjustment to the power gives me that gentle push that I need. My bike rides like a regular one with gears, etc. But if I stop pedaling, the bike stops and I will fall off. It's a really sweet ride and allows me to travel further, and my joints aren't screaming at me when I get home. In the photograph, this is an e-bike fair that we held last year, and the person testing out the e-bike is our local councillor, Mike Hall, and I must say he really enjoyed it. So I hope this very brief overview of e-bikes was helpful to address some of the confusion amongst them, and we can also answer questions shortly. The next slide, I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about my walking and cycling advocacy. My passion for active travel led me after retirement to become a member of Cycle Toronto, and I have become an active volunteer for our local war group. A dream of mine for a long time has been to see a protected bike lane along Yonge Street so that I can safely access all that Yonge has to offer. For my husband and I, Yonge Street is our main street, all the way from Lawrence, where we live, all the way down to downtown. Cycle Toronto Midtown has actually been advocating for protected bike infrastructure along Yonge for over a decade. And when Yonge for All was created, a grassroots group of people living along the pilot complete street, I got straight on board. And as Alison has explained, the Midtown Yonge Complete Street is now to be made permanent. It's a great start, but it's only 3.5 kilometers. So it's going to need to be expanded north and south to connect Yonge up to Eglinton and other destinations outside of Midtown. So along with other active retirees involved in Cycle Toronto, we felt that targeted advocacy to engage more seniors was needed. So just over a year ago, we created Cycle55+. Many older cyclists, especially women like myself, would like to cycle for local transportation, to remain active, and to minimize their environmental impact, but they feel very unsafe on our car-dominant streets. So we're building a base of interested people, and to date, we've hosted several events, including the e-bike fair last summer, along with a climate-themed webinar, and a few group rides to promote projects like Yonge for All and the 15-minute city. It is our hope to grow our membership beyond Midtown and encompass the entire city. So to that end, Cycle55+ is about to embark on a research project. We have a small grant that Cycle Toronto received on our behalf. We hope to learn more about why many older, healthy adults no longer cycle, what it would take to get them back on their bikes for short local trips, how the city's senior strategy could be updated to include more active seniors, and how we might be able to impact policy around cycling and ageism, with the end result to create a series of recommendations that we can take forward to the city. Once we've created the recommendations and submitted our final report, we'll be looking for additional funding to make those recommendations a reality. So that's all about me and my e-bike. I might see you cycling along one of Toronto's expanding complete streets on my e-bike one of these days. So in the meantime, if you're interested in learning more about Cycle 55 Plus, you can flip me an email and it should be right there on the screen. That's my email address.
For those of you that are interested in, learning more about complete streets and e-bikes, the City of Toronto has a wealth of information. So you won't be able to see the link, but if you Google City of Toronto e-bikes, it will bring you to the page, and similar for complete streets. Our last slide talks about getting involved, by encouraging you to sign petitions, to explore the complete streets, and to maybe try a bike share e-bike. We'll take questions.
I try to get to these. That's on the practical side. How often do you have to charge a pedal assist e-bike? Like how far will it take you?
Mine is pretty good. They seem to vary. The more powerful battery you buy, the better, the longer they will go. I was told when I bought mine that I could go for about 95 kilometers on my bike before it needs to be charged. And I've had it for over a year. I don't ride so much in the winter. I'm not a cold weather cyclist, but I've only charged the battery twice.
Okay.
Wow.
That's
And I'll
interesting.
add that I use our Zig e-bike, which is we have a sponsorship with Zig that has a monthly, weekly, or annual rental service for people who want to try ownership of an e-bike without having to commit to the cost of buying one. And it's wonderful. And to get a full charge, it doesn't take more than 2 hours to charge it. And I get generally 60 to 70 kilometers before I need to recharge it.
So you can go quite a ways if you're staying in town.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember is that on the pedal assist e-bike, like the one I have, you have to just keep the battery turned on to the very, very lowest setting, which doesn't really do anything at all. And the one thing that they told me when I bought the bike was, remember that it is still a regular bicycle and you do still have to change the gears. So the gears, just like on a regular bike, will help you to give you that boost, get you up a hill, down a hill, whatever. And he says some people make the mistake because they get so used to the battery of keeping the bike in the same gear all the time, which of course means that gear is going to completely wear out and you're going to need some expensive work on your bike. So ride it like a regular bike, which is what I do. But when you feel with me, it's my knees, they go no. And then I just up the power and off I go. And I can tell you, I couldn't really cycle for any more than about an hour until I got the e-bike. And now I could go for 3-4 hours and it is fantastic.
Great.
They really are a game changer in terms of being able to extend people's trips, because you can use more juice, or you can, it's hard. I'm a believer. I used to, I will admit to briefly thinking that it was lazy and thinking, oh, well, I'll wait to use an e-bike until, like Jacky, I have new hips. But really it enables me, for example, to attend community consultations in Etobicoke or Scarborough and be back, without having to take, more energy. And it's faster than taking public transit.
How prevalent is e-bike theft? Do you know? Are there any stats on that? Is it more of a target for theft than a regular bike?
I would say yes. Now, Alison might have the details from Cycle Toronto's perspective on bike theft. It is huge in Toronto. And one thing that I don't like doing is parking my bike. So when I'm using it for errands, I'm very, very careful. Now, I'm lucky on the bike that I have, I can actually take the battery off and it has a handle on it and I can carry it with me. It's quite heavy, but you might see me in the shop with my shopping bag and my battery because I just don't want to leave it there. I figure the bike isn't much good without the battery. So if I take that with me, and the bikes are heavy, e-bikes are quite heavy. My bike is about, I don't know, 40 odd, whatever. It's quite heavy. It's a lot heavier than my other bike. So for people just to lift it up and run, it's not so good. But yes, they are a target, I would say, for thieves.
But I will add that And as Jacky mentioned, bike theft in general is an issue, as is increasingly car theft. But the biggest issue, so for example, Zig, who has a lot of its members or clients are food couriers that rely on their e-fleet. Most of the thefts that they experience is because they didn't take the time to lock their bike. So if you are going to ride an e-bike or any bike that you want to keep, having a good lock mechanism is important. And for the e-bikes, as with Zig, they do have a really strong locking mechanism. So that's important. Because most of the theft that they experience for food couriers who are on the clock and rushing as quickly as possible, they often think, I'm just going to rush in for a minute. And of course, someone capitalizes and takes off on the bike. So, and then to Jacky's point about being able to easily take the battery out and carry it with you. For example, I do that in the winter because, and this happens with car batteries, that you're going to lose 30% of the charge because of the cold. So taking your e-battery inside will prolong its juice.
I'll ask Diane first, if you could unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm loving all of your presentations. So my situation is a little unique in that the area that I have to store my bike is kind of, I think, those old coal cellars. So I have to go down this very narrow set of stairs. And what's kept me from buying one is the weight, because I have to keep on bringing it up. So one thing you just pointed out is being able to remove the battery. But I didn't know if you could direct me somewhere to, I did some research already, but where I would go to even look at the issue around lighter weight bikes that would make that possible for me.
Yeah, I will just add one thing. I don't know if it'll help you on the stairs. I mean, you could put in one of those little ramp things like you see on some of the steps that go up, and they put a thing beside it. E-bikes have this cool little feature called walk. And so if you have to push your bike, especially if you're pushing it up a hill, you can press the little walk button and it actually gives you a power boost. And it's almost like your bike is taking you up the hill on foot. It's really cool. So there is that feature. But I don't know, Alison, are you aware of, they're getting lighter all the time. And it's just a case of continuing to go and try them out. Maybe Zig is a good option because they probably did they keep up with the latest? No.
Oh, I'm not saying that. I mean, their bikes are excellent, but the reality is e-bikes tend to be a little heavier than normal bikes just because you're going, you're able to go at a faster speed and you're carrying a heavier load just because of the battery. Having that heavier bike makes it more stable. So for example, I wanted to take my e-bike into my gym and there was only 5 stairs. I thought that's not going to be a problem. I got it down without, damaging any walls, but I did need help to carry it back up the 5 steps, and removing the battery didn't make much of a difference. So I would definitely say if you want to explore different e-bikes, try them out. Try lifting them. But as the technology improves, I'm sure they will get a little bit lighter. But definitely there will likely be a little bit more weight to it just because it does make them safer to ride.
And so one other question would be, thank you so much. One other question is where you would suggest us starting to look. You mentioned a fair, and I'm wondering if that would be a good resource for us.
Oh, we held an e-bike fair last summer. The ladies and I that started Cycle55+, we thought it would be good to dispel some of the myths around e-bikes in Midtown Toronto and just get some of the bike shops together and have them set up tents and bring their bikes and allow people to try them out. And so that's what we did. Harvard Village residents group, they did one as well. That sort of inspired ours, and there's more of them happening now. don't have plans to have another one yet, although some of the bike shops that came loved it and said, oh, please do this again. So certainly if you want to get added to the Cycle 55 Plus mail, we can certainly keep that information flowing. And if we hear about any e-bike festivals in and around Toronto, we're certainly be promoting them.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
I think we've run out of time, but we do want to remind people that we're going to stay at the after chat and we can answer, because there's still a lot of questions around cycling. So
Yeah.
hopefully people can stick around for a little bit longer than our usual 11:30 stop. And I'll hand it
Yeah.
back to you, Karen.
Thank you, Michael, for stick handling that. Jennifer, how about you? And also Christy, if you could stay just a few minutes for the after chat. I just want to wrap up, and obviously I want to start by thanking our speakers. Steve, Alison, and Jacky were all fantastic. I know how much everyone learned, and I'm so happy that we've recorded this, and we'll share your slide decks and our slide deck. And the last way to thank you is actually our action of the day was inspired by all three of you. And we'll send these links, they'll be in the chat, but also we'll send them in our follow-up email. You can, on the EV side, you could visit Plug and Drive. Again, Steve's not associated in any commission way with them, but it is a good way for you or a friend or family member to take an EV for a spin. And in addition, make sure you share Steve's deck with them. As far as Cycle Toronto goes, Alison did share some great links and information, whether it's about knowing about Complete Streets, the Young for All campaign. And Alison mentioned that the Midtown pilot was approved, but Young for All is now reconvening. It's a good time to join because they're going to look at Young Street north of Davisville and moving north. So you could get involved with that. There are also petitions that are on their website. We have a link here and we'll send it along. It's called Move 365 campaigns. They're for connecting Toronto with protected bike lanes. So parts of Toronto, connecting them to bike lanes. And there are campaigns for different parts of the city. You'll find it very interesting. We'll send you that link as well under petitions, and not to mention joining Jacky and helping her to build Cycle 55 Plus. Bravo on that. So very quickly, I just wanted to wrap up with a few things because it's just been so exciting today. I have a few quick announcements. In April, we are going to have during there's Earth Day, but also Earth Week events. And we will have details coming. There is a group working on this, and we hope to have some live events for our crawl group. So stay tuned for that. And some of you may be aware we have two other great sessions coming, one in May, one in June. The May one is called Imbibe Greener because we're having presenters on the raw wine movement. It's a unique community of vintners who are committed to producing low intervention, organic, biodynamic, and natural wines, and we can learn all about that. And we're very excited in June to have Bob McDonald, the host of CBC's Quirks and Quarks, come to talk about his new book, The Future Is Now. And it's about solving the climate crisis with today's technologies. So if you want to get a hold of the book from the library or get a copy beforehand, we'll have Bob talking to us at the beginning of June. Just two quick things. We mentioned in our town hall, we have a small fundraising campaign called the Small Change Fund. As people know, we don't have fees for joining CALL. All of us working at CALL are working as volunteers. Our costs are minimal. But we are building our website now so that we can share all of our digital curriculum from all of our great speaker sessions and resources that we have. The website is being built, and so we do have a campaign here. Carolyn will be putting the link into the chat and we'll share it as well. And tax receipts are provided. And so far we've raised $1,100, which is great towards our website hosting goals and building the website. So stay tuned. It'll be ready for beta testing. We have some volunteers who have put up their hands to do that. As always, to reach us, it's contact.us@climatelearners.com. And there's a link that Carolyn will put in the chat for joining our general mailing list, which will send you our monthly newsletter, which went out yesterday. Thanks to Karen Sadlier-Brown and Ann Heber for doing our newsletter. And they have, I believe, a new volunteer helping out. And you also, in addition to getting our newsletter, you'll get notice of these monthly meetings. I mentioned the website is coming. And at our last town hall, Michael Barkley did a presentation on volunteer opportunities. We do have a new volunteer strategy because we need to share the workload more effectively and get more people involved. A lot of people have put their hand up, which is very promising. There's a video explaining this strategy. Carolyn will put the link in the chat, but we'll send it out again. But we have a list of these volunteer tasks with which some are very short term, one-off kind of things. Some are more longer term. We have a new curriculum committee, which we're very excited about. We encourage you to look on our Google Drive. There's a link in the chat to find out about these things. We even have an ad hoc condo committee, which in the after chat, we can ask Karen Sadley or Brown to talk a bit about that. So please get involved, and we appreciate it. Let us know you're interested in, if you have any questions about any of the volunteer tasks or what we want to do or where we need help, or just to chat with any of us on the leadership team. We've got our emails here. We'll send these. And there's an email specifically for volunteership at membership@climatelearners.ca. And thanks again to Steve, Alison, and Jackie. That was just wonderful. And why don't you stay a while for our after chat?
Really, really great presentations.
Yeah.
I learned so much.
Yeah, so did I.
It's really exciting. I want one of those e-bikes.
So do I.
I want one.
I'm also excited you can try it out through Bike Share. Like, it's
Well,
not like you have to commit. You could just try it out.
And Plug and Drive. Karen, you
Yes.
used to be able to go to Plug and Drive to also try out e-bikes.
Oh, not just EV.
Yeah,
I didn't
not
know
just
that.
EV. Yeah.
Cool.
So
Okay, so I apologize because I didn't think Plug and Drive had e-bikes. So, okay, great to know they do.
it's been a
There-
year or so, Steve, since I've been there, but they did when I was there. So hopefully.
Their location has changed. They're in a temporary
Ah.
building right now, and I don't have the address handy. So definitely check the website.
Jennifer, do you wanna-
Jennifer,
oh, yeah.
but Jennifer, go for it.
Okay, two things. One is for Steve, my husband and I were planning on getting an e-vehicle in maybe 2 years' time, and you've persuaded me on the cost front to move it up. But secondly, I was on a holiday recently and rented e-bikes for a couple of days and found I was not getting the exercise I wanted. I wanted the boost for the hilly portions of it, but I ended up turning the battery on and off then over the trip. So I was when I hit a hill, I would turn it on and I'd get the assist going up, and then when I was on the flat, I would turn it off. But I'm wondering how that might impact the battery itself, whether that does some damage to it, or whether just getting a different e-bike that perhaps operated as power assist at a lower level might be a solution.
Yeah, it's Jackie here. I actually do that with my bike. When I start off from home on my bike, it's pretty flat and I do not need the battery. They advised me when I bought it to keep it on the very lowest setting. And at that setting, it doesn't really do anything at all. But it's on, that means the battery is turned on, and when you need it, it's quicker to just boost it up than it is to turn it on and then boost it up. I've tried both, but I do ride it without the battery on at all and just use the gears and ride it like a regular bike. And I find that it rides really well like that, but I definitely need that boost up the hill. So I think what you're doing is fine. It depends on the kind of bike, as long as it is just the pedal assist bike, not the other kind of bike. I don't know what kind of bike you rented. Some of them have more power and are bulkier than others. You can also get the Brompton bikes now as e-bikes. They are quite expensive. Are you familiar with the Brompton bikes? They're a UK company, and they're the fold-up bikes. They fold up and you can carry it with you on the subway. They do now do an e-bike. So for the lady who was talking about down the stairs, that could be a choice, but I do find them quite pricey. I did try one. I'm 6 feet tall. So for me, I found I didn't feel terribly comfortable on it, given my height. But I know people that love them. I know people that like them and love them. And so that could be a good choice as well. But I think what you were doing was probably fine. That's what I do. And you do actually get as much exercise. It's a very, very little amount of energy that you're not burning up using an e-bike. It's almost the same as a regular bike. So you're good.
There were some questions in the chat that were left over as well. Aaron, you had the question about whether you can remove the battery.
Yeah.
And I think they're all removable. I don't think they make e-bikes that where the battery doesn't come with you. So you could take it and charge it in your house and then take it back to the bike. And is there anybody else on the call who wants to just put up their hand or wave or?
Christy has her hand up.
Yeah, so just following up on the comment, I would really like our two speakers who are leaders in the cycling community to consider this. So I'm a 66-year-old acoustic cyclist, and I cycle a lot and cycle downtown from the West End. I live in High Park via Hallam Avenue, which is the best kind of one of the main cycling arteries. And there are no trees there. And in the hot summer days, the hottest summer days, I find the intensity, the heat there to be so great that I feel like from a health point of view, I can't cycle there. And I just want to point out, as a former physician, I can say this, that I know that biologically, the lung capacity of people when they reach the age of 65 is reduced by a third compared to that of a young adult. So like, it's really a serious health issue, heat, for seniors. And if we're going to, encourage seniors to cycle, that issue has to be addressed, and it's critical, and it needs to be included constantly when we're meeting with, the cycling committee with the city, that must be included in cycling infrastructure, trees.
I think that's an excellent point, because you know what happened to me? This was before I had my e-bike. I just was still riding my regular bike. So it was a couple of years ago. I went out on a group ride. It was July. It was a very hot day. And the route that I had to take had no trees. And I actually passed out. And thank heavens, I happened to pass out right near a synagogue over the western part of Midtown. And lots of people stopped to help me, including a paramedic and a doctor. And I was fine, but I was so overcome with the heat, and I was stopping regularly. I was drinking water, but you're absolutely right. On those hot, humid days, it can be very dangerous. So I think maybe the best solution for now is to just choose routes that do have some shade areas. And what I would do is contact my local councillor and say, hey, we need to get more trees planted along here. So yeah, I'm not sure. Alison, did you want to pitch in?
I just wanted to mention that the tree canopy generally in Toronto is an issue, especially for our climate issues. But in terms of cycling and transportation equity, the city of Toronto, we're now in a position where the downtown core is privileged and lucky to have the bulk of the cycling infrastructure. And we are now focused at trying to expand that out, because the people of Scarborough, Etobicoke, North York, they really have few safe transportation alternatives. And most of the arterials that run through the city exist in those spaces. And as people who rely on transit, who bike, even despite the fact that there's an absence of safe infrastructure, but because it's just much more convenient for them and more affordable, the heat out there is even more drastic because they too don't have the tree canopy. So, but absolutely the need to address some of that extreme heat and how it particularly impacts, older adults is absolutely important. But in terms of that being a priority that's included with the bike structure or bike infrastructure, it is increasingly part of complete streets. And the city, where possible, will leverage greenery and trees to provide that safe buffer between, whether it's between the pedestrian realm and the cycling realm, or between the cycling and the vehicular traffic lane.
And Alison, I'm wondering if the City of Toronto has Transform TO, which is their climate action plan. I'm wondering what that says about trees. And obviously trees are wonderful for combating climate change and for cooling down and creating that green canopy. If there might be some way to address it through Transform TO as well.
I will, that the tree canopy is part of the city's Transform TO policies. That said, recently, those of you who've been following the news, Metrolinx has recently, chopped down lots of trees at Osgood and 64 trees at Moss Park, effectively taking the park out of, Moss Park. So it's an ongoing challenge, but they're definitely making efforts on being able to implement or plant more trees and create the overlapping city infrastructure as a way to water them more naturally and help them retain their moisture.
Annabelle had a question about whether there were bike kits, retrofits for bikes, and in our house, we have 2 of our regular bikes that we converted, and we used Switch, which is a British company, and we have loved those bikes. They're fabulous, and it cost about 1/3 of what it cost to buy a new e-bike, and of course you save the manufacturing of the entire bike because you just use the bike you've got. What you get in the kit is the battery and a front wheel, which replaces which becomes the motor. And so you don't have to worry about the gears and the rear wheel difficulties. You're simply using your existing bike. And we've loved these bikes. They go for about 50 kilometers or so on one battery. The batteries are quite small. They're not very heavy anymore. When we first got our bike, they were quite big and quite heavy. And since then, the battery technology has improved, and now they're just tiny things. They're like the size of the original cell phones, if you remember, the ones that look like a brick. That's pretty much the size of the new battery. So they are available. There's a company in Vancouver as well that does a retrofit, but they retrofit the rear wheel, so you have to change the entire gear mechanism. So it's much more complicated.
Yeah, I checked out Switch myself when I was interested in an e-bike. I think they're from the UK, right? And
they are.
They service Canada, the US, Australia, and the UK. I believe they provide that service. And I did look into it. And then I don't know why I didn't go ahead and do it, but I think it actually came from a couple of mechanics that worked at Brompton. I think that's where it originally came from. And it is an excellent idea.
Yeah, and it works. We've had them for 5 years now, and they're just great. So it's a good option to think about. I put the link into the chat, and the chat we will reproduce the chat and send it out to everybody later. So you'll have all these links that are in there. So don't panic if you didn't write it down or can't figure out where it is. You'll get it again soon.
I'm just thinking about what I've learned talking to so many people about EVs and thinking there's probably analogous thing with e-bikes, and maybe the 2 e-bike presenters can comment. But I think often people overestimate the range that they actually need to go on any EV machine. And I'm thinking for EV bikes, probably in the city, I'm wondering the bulk of people probably don't need more than 20 kilometers of range. I'm sure some do, but the bulk don't. And it probably means when you're looking at a vehicle, an EV bike, a lot of people probably could buy a lower range bike and save money and reduce the weight.
Liz.
Thanks. I have a question for Steve. Yeah, I'm not likely to get an e-bike, so I'm still addicted to cars. I went to the Toronto Auto Show to see what they had in terms of small, compact, subcompact EVs. Specifically a plug-in hybrid. and they had one kind that met my requirements. And I'm just wondering, it's, I know that there's way more offerings in Europe and elsewhere in the world, but all I hear is that there's no demand here. But I wonder if it's somewhat of a chicken and egg. They're not available, so people don't buy them. Yeah.
You cut out a bit on me there, but I've turned off my video and I hope it doesn't keep happening. So I think that there's a number of angles to look at this issue. One is that it takes huge investment to bring any vehicle to a marketplace because of all the crash testing and certification for any particular country. And there are smaller EVs in other countries, lots of them, in fact. Millions are made that are used in other countries, but the cost to bring them is huge. I think that a lot of it has to do with the margin that manufacturers can get from current vehicles they're selling. And the fact is, more expensive, bigger vehicles have higher margins. And most of the small economical cars that we've seen in North America over the years, even going back to the Chevy Vega and Pinto and stuff like that, they were brought in because there were mandates for fuel economy and the manufacturers had to meet certain standards for corporate average fuel economy. So we got these little efficient cars. And as cars have become more efficient, they haven't needed to sell as many little cars that are more efficient because the CAFE fuel regulations have been met. EVs switch that on its head. And I think that it's probably more a question of them satisfying the market with the highest margin products they can for now. And we will see somewhat more modest EVs coming into the market over the next decade. But yes, right now in Canada, to mention some brands, the lowest priced EVs are, there's a Mazda EV available in Quebec, and then probably the Chevy Bolt is the next, and those ones are under 40K. Will we see smart car like EVs again? I'm not seeing announcements for this year for those kind of vehicles.
Is there some way of bringing them in from overseas?
Not generally new cars, importing new cars that aren't sold here through the regular automobile chains are very difficult to bring in. And you would also face servicing and parts availability hassles that you probably wouldn't want to have.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering, Steve, whether or not you had any advice for those of us in a condo who are interested in encouraging our board and working with owners in terms of putting in the infrastructure for EV charging.
I have a feeling you may be more on top of this issue than me, Karen. It's certainly come up a number of times when I've been, engaged in various ways with people. I think probably there are two angles to this. One is some condo boards are receptive and seem to be agreeable to supporting people that need to do it, and they somehow, get it through the condo board approval. For condos where it's turning out to be a very steep hill to climb to get an EV charger for even one condo owner, I have a feeling that it's going to be a policy and regulation change that's required. So on that front, it's writing letters to your MPP or your city councillor to, protest the fact that this isn't something that there's a regulatory framework to encourage. One of the big challenges is if the electrical panel is A, close enough to where people need to charge and the circuits for the chargers can be run, and B, does the panel have enough ampacity capacity for a given number of EVs? If the condo board throws up restrictions like we don't have the ampacity capacity, there are technical ways of putting in multiple EV chargers, but having them share the load. So let's say there was a limit of 100 amps that you could put a new charger on, and you want to do 10 cars. Well, there are chargers that will share that power to the 10 cars and not overload the circuit. But again, it becomes a cost issue. How much does it cost for that hardware? And so these are all challenges, and there is no slam dunk solution yet. I know in Coburg, there's a group of people looking at trying to, get the condo scene in Coburg better organized. And I certainly get feedback from people in Toronto but it is highly variable. And the first thing is to go to the condo board and see what they see as the barriers, and then see if those barriers are technical or political at the condo board level. Maybe someone else on the call has some experience with this.
Well, I have a little bit of experience in the condo level, being on an EV committee, and Karen and I talk about this a lot. The board had been working for the previous board, and this is where it gets political, had been working on the development of EV charging in our condo for 7.5 or 8 years, and nothing ever happened. Then a new board was elected, and they suddenly started to take it seriously. And of course, there were a few of us in the building pushing for this, which helped. Suddenly they got the engineers in, they did the studies about the electrical capacity. They did went out to tender for different companies to suggest ways that the EVs could be charging could be put in the building. And the group expected maybe 15 people to sign up, and 85 people signed up.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it was as far as I'm concerned, it's a real success story, and how it came about. But it had to do with the board. The board often is in the way. I think we found that in other discussions around condos, that sometimes it's the board, and it's getting really residents understanding the issues and coming forward. And the interesting thing about the 85 people is that only one of them has an EV, and that's us. Nobody else has one yet. 2 people have ordered one, and it'll be about a year before they get it. But the other 85 people realize that if they want to sell their condo in 5 years or 10 years from now, they don't have an EV charger in place, it's going to be much harder to sell the condo. So they're doing it for economics, and they're doing it as well because they realize that eventually they'll have an EV. But, you know, some just bought a car last year, they're not going to sell it for 5 or 6 or 7 years, but they're going ahead and putting in their chargers anyhow. So
I think that the issue is a little bit like, how are all the natural gas heated homes going to be put onto heat pumps? And at some point, the government, provincial government, maybe with federal cooperation, because, you know, we have national zero emission target, needs to find a way of funding some of the costs associated with places where it will, you know, some condos are going to be expensive to put in EV charging. The electrical panel doesn't have the capacity, it's not in the right place, other issues. And we should be using, in my mind, carbon taxes for funding these kind of things. You know, instead of giving the carbon tax back completely to everyone, a portion of it should be going for all of the costs associated with converting not just condos, but, you know, homes, businesses, institutions. The low carbon transition is going to cost money in some places, and it's going to need support. Exactly how that works with private condo ownership, you know, and private house ownership gets tricky, and we haven't really crossed that big divide yet of really, really getting serious about reducing emissions. We're tinkering around the edges, and we haven't really grasped the essential nature of a very massive program. And the ISO's zero carbon electricity grid forecast, you know, brings up some of those issues about how we're gonna, it's about $400 billion. And we're gonna save more than that on not buying fossil fuels. So it's a net savings to everybody in the end, but the transition is expensive upfront. But then we all save money in the long term.
that's a good point. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Whoops, I'm going to lower my hand.
So
Are we
We're at-
winding down here?
I
'Cause,
think maybe we are.
yeah, we can all
I
go.
see
at
Wendy,
once.
there's a-
Oh, Wendy?
Yeah.
Wendy, do you want to go for it?
Unmute.
Unmute there, Wendy.
Sorry, I was just thinking longer term. So if you put in an EV charger, let's say now, because you'd like to sell your condo somewhere down the line or later on down the line, but the EV charging technology continues to evolve, will that older technology become obsolete, or can they create some kind of an adapter so older technology can meet up with newer technology?
There are two portions, I think, or maybe three portions that we could technically look at. One is the electricity supply. So that's a couple wires that connect to the charger. I don't think there'll be much change there. Most EVs are going to charge on a 30 or 40 amp circuit. So those two wires to the parking stall aren't going to be superseded by some other technology. And then there's the charger itself. And that costs between sort of $800 to $1,500 for various types of chargers. There is a possibility there that, yes, there may be better Wi-Fi or more sophisticated ways of managing charging. But I don't think that it's going to be a substantial enough change that you would throw away your $1,000 charger and buy another one in the next few years. And the chargers themselves are going to last easily, 10 or more years. And then there's the connectors, which are part of the charger, and will the connector change? And then that charger is potentially outdated because the connection to the car has changed. And I think that the connections to the car, the type you use at home, this J1227, it's not going to change in the next decade. It's too established now, and it works fine, and it does everything we need to do. It's not to say it will never change, but I don't see it changing the next decade. So I think all the chargers and connectors we're putting in are going to be good for a decade, probably.
Thank you.
And I also think that they're building the chargers, the charging stations themselves, in a way that the hardware doesn't really need to change. It's the software that will continually update and improve things. Like, so for instance, if there's a better mechanism for connecting to Wi-Fi, that would be a software change rather than having to purchase new hardware.
Just to mention how things are changing, I just wanted to say, when I first met Steve around a year and a half ago, he presented to another group for me. I was complaining that I lived in a downtown neighborhood where I have street parking and there's no way I could get an EV. And since that time, there's now a charging station a block over in my neighborhood off the Danforth. So, and I know Michael was looking, and Gary, guys were looking at chargers in your neighborhood. So obviously that's a moving target, but they're coming. It's
And
not like
also-
other cities where I noticed how many there are in Montreal, by the way. I always notice how other cities are ahead of Toronto. But
And also in the Europe and the UK and, well, in parts of the States, you take a standard light pole and turn it into an EV charger, so that you get street parking that way. So I think that's coming as well. That's probably a little further off, but it's not that far off.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think, and you're right, Montreal has them everywhere. I've got a kid at school in Montreal, and there are thousands in Montreal, but that's
Right.
because their utility is run by the provincial government, and they're an electrically driven province. A huge amount of the heating is electric.
Right.
So they have a
Right.
much faster response time to making these kind of things happen. 5 years ago, there were lots of EV charging stations already in Quebec. So,
Right.
but you're right, it's creeping in. It's imperfect, but it's got lots of, private enterprises seeing the sales of electricity to EVs being a viable business, and they're all chasing it down.
I think we should all get on with our day. And thank you, Steve, for sticking around. And
Hey, thank you for having me today, and look forward to seeing some of you again somewhere. Yeah.
okay,
Right.
thanks
Thank you
again,
so
Steve.
much.
Thanks a
Bye.
lot, Steve.
Yeah, enjoy
Thank
your
you,
outdoor
enough.
sports.
I will.
Yeah.
So
Take
much,
care.
Steve.
Have a good one.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.